Hey, I'm Tucker, and I've compiled the dumbest amusement park deaths I could find, and the deeper I dug, the more I just stared at my screen in disbelief. From a man who spent the entire Ferris wheel ride rocking his cabin when a slight jolt happened, to a dude who unbuckled his restraint at a drop tower and stood up for a selfie, ending his trip in the most stupid way ever. It was June 14th, 2015, at a traveling fairground on a packed dirt lot on the outskirts of Lahore, Pakistan, where generator exhaust mixed with food smoke and a Ferris wheel had been running since early afternoon. By evening, the crowd had filled every lane between the stalls, and the machine that would kill was still turning. Rehan Qureshi was 28 years old and worked as a junior IT consultant at a mid-sized firm in Lahore's commercial district. He had a reputation among his friend group for pushing situations further than called for, not out of aggression, but out of a consistent need to be the most watchable person in any setting. Former classmates described him as someone who turned ordinary moments into performances. However, I don't think he was reckless in a destructive sense. He was reckless the way people are when they've never been seriously hurt and can no longer imagine that they will be. That evening, he had come with 4 friends. The plan was simple: tickets, a ride to the top, photos from the peak. From the moment they boarded, Rehan was already working the crowd, waving at strangers below, rocking the cabin side to side, gripping the outer frame and actively climbing onto the edge of the cabin floor, putting his torso over the restraint. Staff issued verbal warnings twice during the ascent. He acknowledged both with a grin and kept going. The Ferris wheel creaked as it turned, its open frame cabins hanging on pivot joints that allowed a slight, constant sway. Each movement fed into the next, small shifts in weight translating into real motion. Rehan had already climbed partway onto the side frame, testing how far he could lean. The low restraint bar pressed against his thighs, intact but never designed to hold someone who was actively trying to get past it. At that point, I believed the outcome wasn't unpredictable, just delayed. As the wheel neared its highest point, the structure gave a brief mechanical hesitation. The rotation slowed briefly as part of its normal cycle, and the cabin responded immediately, swinging outward a few inches. That was enough. With his weight already shifted, Rehan's center of gravity moved past the pivot point. The cabin swung within its limited arc, no more than a foot of total travel, but the motion carried him with it. His torso cleared the cabin edge. The rotating support arms and lateral bracing at that radius moved slowly, roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour relative to a stationary body. He was pinned and scraped along the nearest support arm, not struck repeatedly by multiple segments. Witnesses in adjacent cabins described a sudden crushing impact against a lateral brace, followed by him being wedged against the frame as the cabin continued its rotation, unfolding over several seconds. One leg remained caught against the cabin floor, the only reason his body didn't fall to the lot below. His head struck a single lateral cross brace during the wedging, and a fair employee at the control panel, who had been monitoring the ride, hit the emergency stop button. The wheel coasted several more seconds on rotational inertia before halting, leaving Rehan's cabin suspended approximately 40 feet above the ground. A bystander placed the emergency call, and paramedics could only declare death at the scene. The medical examiner documented blunt force trauma to the anterior thorax, fractures to the sternum and 4 left side ribs, traumatic brain injury consistent with high force contact against a rigid structure, and acute internal hemorrhaging in the thoracic cavity. The injuries were not survivable. His 4 friends left the fairground together that night without speaking to anyone. I've read through a lot of accounts like this one, and this isn't some unpredictable freak accident. It's what happens when someone keeps escalating until reality finally answers back. What makes this one stand out isn't the violence, it's how completely unnecessary it was. He didn't get unlucky, he just ran out of chances. The next story features a construction foreman who climbed out of a bumper car to start an argument, and the floor he stepped onto was already moving. It was Saturday, March 19th, 2016, at an indoor amusement center on the north side of Durban, South Africa, when a disagreement over bumper cars ended the way most people who knew Lwazi Ndlovu probably would have expected, badly, and entirely because of him. Lwazi was 30 years old and worked as a construction foreman on mid-scale residential builds across the greater Durban area. People who worked with him described a man who was competent at the job and terrible to be around. He had a reputation for escalating minor disputes on site, noise complaints from subcontractors, schedule disagreements with suppliers, into prolonged confrontations that sometimes became physical. He had been fired twice in 5 years and rehired both times because he was genuinely skilled at managing pores and foundations. That combination, useful and volatile, is a difficult one for everyone around you to navigate. He had come to the amusement center that afternoon with a group from a social gathering nearby. The bumper car session was unplanned. He had no particular reason to be there beyond proximity. The arena was a standard oval enclosure, roughly 60 feet across, with rubberized floor panels and overhead electrical contact rails powering a fleet of 12 cars. On a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, 11 of the 12 cars were occupied, with spectators pressed along the perimeter barriers. Midway through the session, Loazi's car was struck from the side by another rider, a standard bumper car collision, which is the entire premise of the activity. He climbed out of his car while the session was still running and began walking toward the other rider. Witnesses at the barrier later told staff he was moving with his arms raised. Other riders began steering sharply away from him, but the enclosure noise, music, impacts, crowd absorbed the warnings entirely. The arena staff were positioned at the entry queue on the far side and did not see him exit. He had covered roughly 15 feet on foot before the first car hit him. A staff member closer to the arena noticed him immediately and hit the emergency stop switch within 15 seconds of him leaving his car. The impact caught him from behind at the left knee. He went down hard, striking the front of his head against the rubberized floor. A second car, operated by a teenage rider with no time to steer away, rolled into him within 2 seconds, its front bumper catching him across the lower torso as he was still down, adding a second impact before the ride could be stopped. A bystander climbed the barrier and grabbed Loazi's arm to drag him clear, but the stalled car's position slowed the extraction for several seconds. EMS was called immediately and arrived 12 minutes later. Loazi was transported to a regional hospital and taken directly into emergency surgery. He died on the operating table from severe head trauma and internal injuries. I won't pretend this is a tragedy in the conventional sense. A man climbed into an active arena because he was angry, and the arena didn't accommodate him. Police and municipal inspectors were involved in a formal review. The amusement center closed for 2 days and resumed operations following a comprehensive safety inspection. Loazi had no immediate family willing to arrange services. His ex-wife, from whom he had been separated for 3 years, organized and paid for his funeral out of what people who knew her described simply as decency. I think it's kind of ironic that the only person who showed up to handle things was someone he had already pushed out of his life. The next story took a completely different turn for me. A man celebrated the biggest promotion of his career, and the last thing anyone saw was the water pulling him under. It was August 3rd, 2017, at a commercial water park on the northern outskirts of Mumbai, India. A day hot enough that the concrete paths burned underfoot, and one man was about to find the single mechanism in that park built to move water at force at exactly the wrong moment. Ronak Setia was 34 years old and worked as a shift supervisor at a regional freight distribution company in Mumbai's western suburbs. His co-workers described him as loud in the way that tends to read as confidence, always the first to suggest a round, always the last to leave. He had been passed over for a senior logistics role twice before finally receiving a promotion the previous week. The water park trip was his idea of marking the occasion properly. He arrived with 4 co-workers mid-morning, carrying a cooler bag that gate staff later confirmed was only superficially inspected and not fully checked against restricted area rules. By early afternoon, witnesses placed him near the deep end of the wave pool, unsteady, laughing at nothing in particular, submerging near the far wall and surfacing again. Lifeguards had shouted at him at least 3 times. He had climbed over a waist-high metal fence marking the clearly signed restricted mechanical area. I kept thinking about how this ends differently if he just turns around once. The wave pool used a pneumatic system, with guarded intake grates behind a reinforced wall pulling water inward every 40 seconds to generate waves. Families at the shallow end told investigators they watched Ronak submerging near the far wall repeatedly. 2 children on the pool steps pointed at him. Their parents began moving them toward the exit. Park CCTV captured him entering the restricted zone despite repeated warnings. Then the next cycle began. Witnesses described the water near the far wall pulling inward in a visible depression before Ronak was pressed against the grate by the suction. The force pinned him in place, preventing coordinated movement, and his chest was held tightly against the grate, restricting his ability to breathe. He did not struggle effectively, his limbs flailing briefly before his body went still. Lifeguards reached him within 20 seconds and attempted to pull pull him free by his arms and torso. They could not move him. One guard later described the resistance as similar to trying to pull someone against a fixed steel structure underwater. A second guard entered the water and tried to wedge between Ronak's body and the grate. He could not get any leverage. A lifeguard immediately activated the emergency stop switch within seconds of seeing him trapped. Staff cut power to the wave system after roughly 10 more seconds, and the suction released. Ronak was pulled to the pool's edge. Medical observers at the scene noted signs of severe chest compression from the sustained pressure against the grate, particularly on the right side. He was not breathing and had no pulse. Bystanders on the deck stood back. Several covered their children's eyes. Park staff contacted emergency services the moment the system was stopped. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and worked on him poolside. No pulse was established. He was declared dead at the scene. The medical examiner found multiple bilateral rib fractures consistent with sustained compressive force, pulmonary contusion to both lung fields, traumatic cardiac compression, and hypoxic brain injury. Cause of death was compressive asphyxia with secondary cardiac arrest. Ronak's family held the funeral 4 days later at a cremation ground in his home district. His co-workers attended as a group. The promotion that had started the day was mentioned once, briefly, by someone near the back. I think about the lifeguards who reached him in 20 seconds and still could not pull him free. They did everything they were supposed to, and I don't think any training truly prepares you for that. Alright, so this next one actually made me pause when I was researching it, because at least with Anil you can chalk it up to alcohol and poor judgment. This next one is just pure entitlement. It was January 19, 2018, at an outdoor amusement complex near a commercial strip in Bangkok, Thailand, on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature sat at 91 degrees and the midway was thick with families moving between attractions. Marisa Lay was 42 years old and worked as a senior procurement officer at a mid-sized logistics firm based in Singapore. She had traveled to Bangkok alone on a 3-day trip, her third visit to the city in 2 years. People who worked alongside her described her as effective but chronically difficult. Former colleagues told investigators she had a consistent pattern of escalating disputes with vendors, security personnel, and service workers when a decision didn't go her way. Based on interviews, I got the sense that she was critical to a fault, and she had a long track record of getting what she wanted by refusing to accept no. At the attraction that afternoon, an operator informed Marisa she exceeded the posted weight limit of 220 pounds. She weighed 231 pounds according to the medical examiner's report. 2 families with children were standing nearby. Staff attempted to redirect her to a different attraction. She held her position at the gate for approximately 3 minutes, loudly refusing to leave before a second operator arrived. Neither staff member physically blocked the gate opening. That detail matters. As the argument stalled, the ride continued cycling behind her. Gondola cars sweeping around the central axis at full speed, cutting a wide arc just inside the perimeter fence. Each pass came fast and low, close enough that the air shifted with it. The fence marked the limit for a reason. The gate beside her was supposed to stay locked while the ride was in motion. Marisa reached for it anyway. The latch resisted the first time, then again, before lifting free on the second attempt, the loosened spring giving way under pressure. She stepped through and moved a few feet inside. A gondola car came around at full operational speed and struck her on the left side, the force from the several hundred-pound car transferring instantly on impact and throwing her laterally into an inner fence post. She did not fall immediately. Witnesses described her remaining partially upright against the post for 1 to 2 seconds as another arm completed its rotation and swept back through. It caught her lower body and pinned her briefly against the post as nearby staff rushed to hit the emergency stop. The emergency stop triggered almost immediately, but the ride carried through a short coasting distance before halting completely. From the moment she stepped inside to the moment the gondola stopped moving, it lasted only a few seconds. I've gone over this sequence more than once. It's so obvious but also crazy to me that 4 seconds is more than enough time for this kind of damage to become unsurvivable. Staff on site called emergency services immediately following the second impact. Marisa was unresponsive when paramedics reached her and was pronounced dead. The medical examiner documented blunt thoracic trauma with multiple rib fractures, traumatic splenic rupture, bilateral pelvic fractures, and crush injuries to the left femur consistent with high-force mechanical compression. The cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, secondary to internal injuries. The ride was closed for the remainder of the day. Local authorities investigated and issued minor citations to the operating company related to gate barrier standards. No criminal criminal charges were filed. The citations were resolved administratively within 2 months. Every layer of this, the posted weight limit, the unlocked gate, the moving ride, even her history of pushing past resistance, lined up in a way that left almost no margin for error once she made that final decision. The staff should have had a fully secured barrier, no question, but at the same time, stepping into an active ride envelope is one of those actions where the consequence is immediate and unforgiving. Meanwhile, for the next story, it wasn't one person ignoring the rules, it was two, and the fact that they were laughing the whole time makes it so much harder to watch. It was October 10th, 2015, at a large amusement park on the eastern edge of Kolkata, India, where the afternoon heat pressed flat against every surface and the smell of fried food drifted across softened asphalt. By the time an emergency operator received the first call, the coaster was still moving along the return track. Riva Chandra was 20 years old, a second-year commerce student at a mid-sized city university. Devon Suri was 19 and in his first year of the same program. They had been together for just under a month. Friends later described them as almost inseparable in the way new couples tend to be, loud about it, close in public, prone to making decisions together that neither would have made alone. I think we've all been there, and having that in mind made me sympathize with them a little more in this story. They had come to the park with a group of classmates. By early afternoon, the group had split off toward different areas, leaving Riva and Devon on their own. Devon had been photographing the visit since they arrived. Selfies at every stop, video clips of rides from outside the queues. His camera roll, recovered by investigators, showed 43 photos taken that day before the last one. The coaster swept through its circuit, steel cars rattling along a track that curved back toward the station through a banked section partially hidden behind support beams. From the pathway, the view cut off just before the turn, a blind spot where the train would reappear with little warning. A chain-link fence ran along that stretch, broken only by a single staff-only crossing point. When I picture that blind spot, it just feels like a place you don't step into unless you completely ignore what it is. Riva and Devon moved toward it as the ride cycled. They climbed over the small maintenance gate and stepped onto the return track. A family near the queue noticed first, watching as the two of them walked further in. A park employee about 40 feet away shouted at them twice. Two other visitors along the fence line joined in. Neither of them reacted. Devon had his phone raised, angled down the track where the train would come out of the blind curve, framing the shot. And for what? Honestly, a photo that wasn't even going to be worth it? The train entered the banked curve at approximately 28 miles per hour. The operator in the control booth had no sightline to that section of the return track. A bystander struck the alert panel on the outer fence, and the operator engaged the emergency brake, but the train had already closed the distance. The front car made contact with both of them within the same second. Witnesses standing near the queue described the sound as short and dull. Not the crash most people imagine, but something closer to an impact absorbed by mass. It was over in under 2 seconds. Riva's body was thrown laterally and struck a vertical support column at the track's edge, coming to rest against its base roughly 6 feet from the point of impact. A family with young children standing nearby watched her slide against the concrete and stop moving. Devon was caught beneath the front section of the car as the emergency brake engaged, his lower body pinned against the rail and frame. The train came to a full stop approximately 11 feet past the point of contact. The operator immediately called park dispatch. A staff supervisor reached the scene within 3 minutes. Emergency medical services arrived in 10 minutes. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report identified blunt force polytrauma in both victims, compound pelvic and lower extremity fractures, bilateral rib fractures, internal hemorrhaging consistent with high-velocity blunt impact, and cranial trauma. Neither survived long enough for intervention. The park suspended operations on the ride for 3 days pending inspection. No mechanical fault was identified anywhere in the system. Local amusement park authorities conducted a post-incident inspection before the ride reopened. Riva and Devon's families received their belongings, including Devon's phone, within the week. I don't think this story has a version where the outcome changes without one of them choosing not to cross that barrier. This next guy was already at the top, already strapped in, already safe, and then he made a choice. It was May 27, 2016, at a large commercial amusement complex in Shenzhen, China, where a drop tower stood roughly 130 feet above a concrete service plaza, and by mid-afternoon, one of its carriages had already completed several full cycles without incident, until the last one. Kale Tong was 23 years old and worked as a graphic designer at a mid-sized branding agency in Shenzhen. Apparently, his portfolio was strong enough that his supervisor had recommended him for a senior role the previous month. Friends described him as someone who was always moving. Weekends were spent rock climbing, urban hiking, or capturing footage from elevated vantage points across the city. He had built a modest following on a domestic short video platform, almost entirely from content filmed in high places. He visited the complex that afternoon with 3 co-workers as part of an informal team outing. Drop towers of this class accelerate riders downward at speeds approaching 55 miles per hour. The over-the-shoulder restraint system is engineered to hold each occupant at a fixed torso position against a rigid seat back. The geometry matters because the harness distributes deceleration force across the chest and lap simultaneously. Investigations later showed that Kale had pushed upward aggressively against his restraint, shifting his torso slightly forward and creating partial separation from the seat back. A standing or partially upright occupant removes that distribution entirely. The carriage held 8 riders that cycle. Kale was positioned in an outer-facing seat on the upper ring. Footage recovered from a bystander's phone, filmed from the plaza below, captured the 30 seconds before the drop initiated. The footage captured the carriage from the plaza below, showing Kale shifting upward against the restraint and other riders' reactions, though his exact upper body motion is partially obscured by the carriage frame. Other riders on the carriage were visibly and audibly reacting. A staff member at the base noticed the movement and attempted to halt the ride via emergency stop, but the carriage had already entered the pre-release sequence, leaving no time to intervene. The drop initiated. I think about the window between the moment that staff member reached the panel and the moment the ride released, and I genuinely don't know how anyone who watched that footage walks away without it changing them. The bystander footage shows Kale's body, shifted forward and partially separated from the seat back, thrown against the interior rail of the carriage within the first 2 seconds of descent. The impact with the rail was not glancing. His left arm and shoulder struck the restraint and seat structure at full downward acceleration, and the momentum carried his upper body forward while his lower body remained partially seated. The total descent from 130 feet at those speeds takes under 3 seconds. What the footage captures in that window is not dramatic in any cinematic sense. It is mechanical, brief, and completely without corrective motion. The force of the descent continued to drive his body against the restraint and inner frame of the carriage, with no recovery of position before the ride reached the lower section. He did not reach the concrete service platform below. Witnesses at the base described a sound that several of them initially mistook for a mechanical malfunction, a single dense impact, before they processed what they were seeing. Bystanders called emergency services immediately. EMS arrived in 7 minutes, but he did not survive. Cause of death was listed as multi-system traumatic injury, consistent with high-velocity impact against a rigid structure during free-fall descent. The ride was closed for investigation. Staff at the facility completed additional safety protocol training in the weeks that followed, with revised procedures for pre-launch restraint verification put in place. I've read a lot of these incidents, and what is disturbing to me here isn't the decision itself. It's that 8 people were strapped into that carriage and had no way to stop what was about to happen to everyone around them. That part doesn't leave you easily.